The woman in white had run the Meridian Sterling Tower in Chicago for 9 years, and in all that time, she'd never once ridden the service elevator or set foot on the floor where her night crew clocked in. So when she spotted the janitor standing in the middle of her anniversary gala, in a plain dark shirt with a worn leather case tucked under his arm, surrounded by investors and cameras and people who mattered, Sloane Whitfield didn't ask his name. She raised one hand, pointed at the doors, and said it loud enough for the whole marble lobby to hear. "Security. Remove him. He doesn't belong in this room." He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. Everett Donovan just looked at her a second longer than was comfortable, and said something so quiet that only the people standing closest caught it. "You might want to check your last deal, ma'am." Somebody laughed. Somebody else lifted a phone and started recording, and across that lobby, a 27-year-old woman named Tessa Marlowe stood frozen with a mop in her hands, watching a man get thrown out into the cold for wearing the same uniform she was wearing. Not one person in that building knew who he really was. Not one of them knew that the money keeping their paychecks alive came down to a single signature, and that the man walking out those doors was the only one alive who could write it. If stories about dignity and quiet strength move you, please hit that like button. It helps this channel more than you know. Share it with someone who's ever been looked straight through at work, and if you're new here, subscribe and stay with us. Now let's go back to that marble lobby in Chicago, and to the 90 seconds that were about to cost Sloane Whitfield everything. The revolving door turned twice, and then slowed, and Otis Reed kept his hand a few inches from the other man's elbow, neither gripping nor pushing, as though he were escorting a guest rather than removing someone who had been thrown out. He had worked security at this tower since before the woman in white had arrived, long enough to know what the feeling inside his chest was called. When they reached the steps, the river wind swept across them, and he lowered his voice until it was barely loud enough for the two of them to hear. "I'm sorry, son. I truly am." Everett turned and looked at him, and there wasn't a trace of anger in his eyes, only a quiet attentiveness that made Otis feel as though, for the first time that evening, someone had truly seen him. "You don't need to apologize for a decision that wasn't yours," he said. "You only did what you were told to do. The person who gave the order is the one who has to answer for it." Otis opened his mouth to say something more, but Everett had already stepped down from the last stair, and the glass closed between them. Inside, the music rose again. Wine glasses touched once more, and the grand hall returned to itself with a speed that felt almost cruel. Only Tessa Marlowe hadn't moved. She was still standing exactly where she had been, one hand wrapped around the handle of her mop, and only after everyone else had turned away did she lower her eyes toward the base of the white floral pedestal beside the walkway. The leather briefcase lay tilted there, its corners worn pale, its handle polished smooth by years of use, the only object in the room that looked as though it had traveled through time instead of having just been purchased for display. She picked it up, and it was heavier than she had expected. "Sir," she called, hurrying several steps toward the door. "You forgot your briefcase." But the revolving door had already come to a stop. Outside, only the streaks of car lights glided across the wet pavement, and a passing server looked at her the way people look at someone who has spoken too loudly in church. Tessa lowered her arm. She stood there a little longer, holding the briefcase against her chest, then walked toward the freight elevator at the end of the corridor, the same way she went every night. When she reached the basement, she opened her employee locker, placed the briefcase in the bottom compartment, locked it, then took down the shift log hanging on the wall and wrote in careful, even handwriting, found a guest's leather briefcase in the grand hall, secured it for safekeeping, will return it when someone comes to claim it. She signed her name underneath. She had never kept someone else's belongings for more than one night, and she had never imagined there would come a day when she would have to. Meanwhile, upstairs in the grand hall, Sloane Whitfield had returned to the podium. She adjusted the microphone, waited for the murmuring to fade, then smiled a smile she had practiced in front of the mirror so many times that it appeared by reflex. "My apologies, ladies and gentlemen, for that minor interruption," she said, and the whole room laughed with her. "I've always said our security team works exceptionally well. Tonight, you had the chance to see it for yourselves." Applause rose through the room, warm and easy, and Sloane felt the ground grow steady beneath her feet again. She went on to speak about her 9 years of leading the tower, about the people who had stood beside her through every difficult season, and about how the measure of a great organization lay in the standards it would never lower. She believed every word she said. That was the most frightening thing of all. In the corner of the room, Warren Pike stood leaning against a column, his wine untouched, his eyes still fixed on the closed revolving door, a thin sheen of sweat across his forehead that no one noticed. Outside, less than a block away, Everett Donovan stopped beneath the awning of a shuttered storefront, raised his collar against the wind, and took out his phone. He didn't call a lawyer, he didn't call the press. He dialed a single number, and the moment the person on the other end answered, he spoke one sentence, his voice as calm as a man announcing a train's departure time. "Stop everything." Bridget Quinn was silent for a beat. She had worked with him long enough to know what those two words meant, and long enough to know that when he spoke in that tone, no questions were permitted. "Phase 2 as well?" she asked. "Everything," he replied. "Preserve every page of every file exactly as it is. Notify no one. Not one word leaves the office." Then he ended the call, slipped the phone into his pocket, and stood there a little longer, looking back at the brightly lit tower behind him, where 4,000 people slept peacefully in the belief that they would still have jobs tomorrow. He knew something no one inside that building knew. He had just lost his briefcase, and inside that briefcase was something this entire company would be brought to its knees searching for before winter came to an end. Tessa Marlowe woke before the sky had decided whether it was still night or already morning, and her day began with the smell of hot grease at the diner on the corner of Halsted, where she tied on an apron, poured coffee, carried plates, and called regular customers by name without needing to look at their orders. People liked her there because she remembered who didn't eat onions, who needed extra ice, who had just lost a job and needed to sit for another half hour without being reminded to leave. By afternoon, when her morning shift ended, she took off her apron, folded it, slipped it into her cloth bag, then caught the bus that ran along the river toward the glass towers. On the bus, she sat in the back seat, opened her wallet, and counted. The small tips from the morning, the crumpled bills, the few coins rolling along the bottom of her wallet. In her mind, she divided them into portions. This part was for rent, this part for her monthly bus pass, and the largest portion, always the largest, was set aside for Hawthorne. Hawthorne Nursing Home stood at the western edge of the city, a low brick building with a porch and several rocking chairs that no one sat in at this time of year. Her grandmother lived in the last room at the end of the hall, beside a window overlooking the lawn. There were days when Tessa walked in and her grandmother looked up, her eyes growing bright, calling Tessa's name before she had even crossed the threshold, asking whether she had eaten, asking if it was cold outside, and retelling the story of how Tessa, at 7 years old, had cut off all her bangs with a pair of paper scissors. On those days, the two of them sat together until a nurse had to remind them of the time. Then there were other days. Days when Tessa walked in and her grandmother studied her for a long while, polite and distant, then asked if she was the new nurse. Tessa had learned not to correct her. She would simply sit down, take that frail hand in hers, and say, "Yes, I've come to sit with you for a little while." Her parents had died when she was 12, and from that day until Tessa was old enough to find work of her own, this woman had been the only family she had in the world. Tessa had nearly completed 2 years of nursing school when her grandmother began forgetting the way home, and she had left the classroom without telling anyone why, because saying it aloud sounded too much like complaining, and complaining wouldn't change anything. By 7 o'clock that evening, she was in the basement of Meridian Sterling Tower, changing into her uniform, collecting her cart, and signing her name on the assignment sheet. Dale Kruger, the cleaning department manager, sat inside the small glass office with the table fan that rattled all year long, and at the end of every week, he handed her a timesheet he had already approved and signed. Tessa looked down at the line showing her hours, then raised her eyes to him. "I worked 3 extra nights this week, Mr. Kruger. They aren't listed here." Kruger didn't look away from his screen. "The system calculates standard shifts, Marlowe. Just sign it and I'll look into it later." She had heard those words so many times that she couldn't remember when he had first said them. "You said the same thing last time." Only then did he look up, and he smiled, a gentle smile that was almost kind. "Tessa, I know you're struggling. Everyone here is struggling, but you need to understand that they're considering cutting the night shift. I'm the one who recommends which names stay on the list. I always put yours at the top because I care about you." He pushed the pen toward her. "You're a smart woman. Don't turn a small matter into a large one." Tessa picked up the pen. She thought about the hallway lined with rocking chairs, about the woman in the last room, about how much longer Hawthorne would keep her if Tessa lost this job. She signed. Then she pushed her cart into the corridor, pressed the button for the freight elevator, and began her shift as she did every night. When she reached the 40th floor, her first task was always the record storage room at the end of the eastern corridor. She took the key from the box on the wall, unlocked the door, then wrote in the logbook resting on the small table just inside the entrance her name, the time the door was opened, and her signature. A small routine, one line every night, as ordinary as brushing her teeth before bed. She closed the book and went to clean the hallway. Close to 2 o'clock in the morning, she went out to the loading dock behind the building to eat, the only place in the entire tower where no one drove anyone else away. The man who had started working the night shift the previous week was already sitting on the concrete step, his back against the wall, his hands empty. He spoke little, greeted people politely, worked neatly, and no one knew anything more about him than the name written on his badge, Ev. "Didn't you bring anything to eat?" she asked. "I forgot," he replied. Tessa looked down at her cold lunch, cold rice and a piece of fried chicken left over from her morning shift, then opened the lid, divided the food in half with the edge of her plastic fork, and pushed one portion toward him. "Eat. The night is still long." He looked at that half portion of food longer than necessary, as though it were something no one had ever offered him before, then finally accepted it and quietly said thank you. The man who sat eating half a box of cold food on the loading dock that night had been inside Meridian Sterling Tower for 5 weeks, and not one person in the building knew why. His grandfather had begun as a doorman on the south side of the city, a man with nothing but his hands and a good memory, and the family he built from there had endured through 3 generations, rising from back rooms behind storefronts to the highest reaches of Chicago finance. But what he left his descendants wasn't money. He left them a principle, and that principle contained only one line: never give a man money until you've seen how he treats the person who cleans his floors. Everett's father had lived by it. Everett did too. Iron Line Capital had extended Meridian Sterling, a bridge loan that summer, enough to let the company breathe through the fall, and the second disbursement still hung there like a door that hadn't fully closed. 20 other funds had reviewed Meridian's records and shaken their heads. Some saw the debt. Others saw the acquisition of the failing hotel chain that Sloane Whitfield had once stood on stage and called a historic turning point. Iron Line was the last open door, and Bridget Quinn had told him exactly once that the figure was too large to risk in this way. He had replied that it was precisely because the figure was so large that he needed to go down there and see for himself. For 5 weeks, he pushed carts, mopped hallways, emptied trash cans, and learned more than all the reports had ever told him. He learned that employees on the night shift weren't allowed to use the main elevators, a rule that appeared in no official document, only on a notice posted in the locker room, yet anyone who violated it had their name written down. He learned that the table fan in Kruger's glass office rattled all year long, and that people signed timesheets with missing hours without daring to question them, because if they did, their names would disappear from some list. He learned that one woman had taken the blame for an older cleaning woman and hadn't told anyone. He also learned that throughout those 5 weeks, not one executive in the tower had looked him directly in the eye, except one. That night, Sloane Whitfield had returned to retrieve some documents and taken a shortcut through a hallway that had just been mopped, and she slipped. She didn't fall. She merely stumbled forward and caught herself against the wall, and when she straightened, her anger arrived before her fear. "Who left this sign blocking my way?" she asked, her voice as sharp as a paper knife. He was standing a few steps away. "I put it there, ma'am." She looked at him for the first time. "It's in the way. It's there to keep you from falling," he said. He didn't raise his voice, and he didn't apologize. It was simply a statement placed between them. Sloane stood still for a beat, and within that beat was something that disturbed her more than the slip itself, because in all her 9 years at the tower, no one had ever answered her that way without following it with an apology. She walked away without another word, but she remembered his face. She remembered it very well. Then came the final night. Everett was pushing his cart through the eastern corridor when he noticed a light still burning inside an office, and Warren Pike stood with his back to the door, a phone pressed to his ear, his voice low but urgent, in the way of a man who had lost his composure long ago and was still pretending he hadn't. Everett didn't stop. He kept pushing the cart past the office, slowly, and during the 2 seconds it took him to cross the half-open doorway, he heard exactly half of a sentence. "Iron Line has planted someone here. I'm certain of it. He's inside this building." Everett kept walking without looking back, and the wheels of his cart continued turning with the same steady rhythm as before. He didn't know who was on the other end of the call, but he knew 3 things immediately. First, someone on the executive team was frightened enough to make a call at midnight. Second, anyone that frightened was hiding something far greater than a loss recorded in the books. Third, his role had expired, and if he remained at the bottom of this tower for 1 more week, they would find him before he found them. The next morning, he called Bridget and told her to prepare the documents for the second disbursement and bring them to the tower on the night of the gala, because that evening he would walk upstairs under his real name. He had calculated everything except one thing. He hadn't accounted for the fact that it would take only 90 seconds of walking through the grand hall for the woman in white to recognize the face of the janitor who had once dared to answer her. By 9 o'clock the next morning, Sloane Whitfield had been sitting behind her desk for more than an hour, and the first thing she did wasn't to read the financial report. "June, has last night's security report been entered into the system yet?" June Callahan stood in the doorway with a tablet in her hands. "Yes, ma'am, Mr. Reed submitted it before dawn." "Read it to me." June opened the report and began reading, but Sloane raised one hand before she had gone beyond the 3rd sentence. An individual identified as a member of the night cleaning staff, exhibiting no disruptive behavior, was asked to leave the area and departed voluntarily. Sloane repeated every word slowly, as though the sentence had an odor. "Change it." June didn't move. "How would you like it changed?" An unidentified individual appeared in a restricted area, failed to present identification, displayed suspicious behavior, and was escorted from the premises by security. She delivered the entire sentence without stumbling over a single word, as though she had written it in her mind the night before, and removed the phrase cleaning staff. June remained where she was for another beat. She had worked as this woman's assistant for nearly 4 years, and in those 4 years, she had learned that there were times when silence was the only way to keep her seat. "Yes, ma'am," she said, then turned and left. By noon, the matter had moved beyond the reach of any written report. A video recorded on a guest's phone had passed through 3 online sites, then appeared on the afternoon broadcast of a local station, and by late afternoon, there were more comments beneath it than there were employees in the entire company. People weren't talking about Meridian Sterling. They were talking about the hand pointing straight toward the door, about the words "he doesn't belong in this room," and about the face of a man who hadn't spoken a single word in protest. Sloane summoned the communications department, sat through a 2-hour meeting, and emerged with a statement she believed was strong enough to hold. Then, at 4 o'clock, the email from Ironline Capital arrived. It was so brief that she had to read it a second time to make certain she hadn't missed anything. Ironline Capital hereby announces the suspension of the entire second disbursement process and the activation of the review clause governing the existing bridge loan. Signed, Bridget Quinn, Authorized Representative. When Warren Pike finished reading it, he placed the page on the desk with both hands, very carefully, as though he were afraid it might break. "How much time do we have?" Sloane asked. "If they review the existing loan," Pike said, "then it's no longer a question of how much time we have. It's a question of whether we'll be permitted to exist through the end of this quarter." Sloane rose, walked to the window, and when she turned around, there was a decision written across her face. "We aren't the party at fault," she said. "Someone infiltrated this building under the guise of a cleaning employee. That is unlawful entry. That is industrial espionage. June, bring me his entire personnel file, employment contract, application, identification documents, timesheets, everything. I want a complete case file prepared for the attorneys before tomorrow morning." By 7 o'clock that evening, the documents had been brought upstairs, pitifully thin, because what was there to preserve about a member of the night cleaning staff? Sloane turned through every page herself. A temporary employment contract, copies of identification documents, assignment sheets, and at the very bottom, the night shift acknowledgement slips, each containing a single line, each line marked with a hurried ballpoint signature. She flipped through them and was about to push the entire stack aside when her finger stopped. There was something in that handwriting. It wasn't the name, because the name consisted of only 2 hastily written letters. It was the way the final stroke swept upward and then curved back, a habit of the hand that no one ever loses, no matter how quickly they write. She had seen that stroke somewhere before. She sat motionless for a very long time. Then she stood, walked to the filing cabinet behind her, unlocked the drawer, and removed the original bridge loan agreement with Ironline Capital the thick stack of papers she had once held in her hands on the day it was signed. She had never met the person who headed the fund, because throughout the negotiations, everything had gone through Bridget Quinn, and there had been no one across the table except attorneys. She turned to the final page. There, beneath the words "Authorized Representative," was a signature. She placed the night shift slip beside it. The same slant, the same upward stroke curving back upon itself, the same hand. The only sound left in the room was the air conditioner. Sloane Whitfield lowered herself into her chair very slowly, as though she feared that if she sat down too quickly, the chair would no longer be there, and she stared at the 2 pages lying side by side on her desk for a length of time she would later be unable to remember. Then she pressed the intercom button, and the voice that emerged didn't sound like her own. "June." "Yes, ma'am." For 9 years, she had run this tower. For 9 years, she had walked through hallways cleaned every night, and had never once stopped. "The man from last night," she said. "What is his name?" The next morning, Sloane Whitfield entered the conference room with 2 pages in her briefcase and a fully formed story in her mind. She knew exactly what she had done in the grand hall that night. She also knew that if the story ended there, the entire city would remember her only as the woman who had thrown a man out of the room because he wore a janitor's uniform. There was only one way out, and that way required her to change roles. "What happened here wasn't a reception incident," she told the executive team. "An investment fund placed someone inside our building under the guise of a cleaning employee so he could gain access to restricted areas without going through any established procedure. We aren't the party responsible for what happened. We're the party whose building was infiltrated." No one in the room objected. Some lowered their eyes to the table. Warren Pike was the first to speak, and he spoke more quickly than necessary. If this was an infiltration, then someone on the inside must have helped him. No one gets through 3 layers of access control unless someone opens a door. He opened his computer, turned the screen toward the center of the table, and played footage from the loading dock behind the building. At 2 o'clock in the morning, a woman opened a container of food, divided it in half, and pushed one portion toward the man sitting beside her. The image was blurry, and there was no sound, and in the silence of the conference room, it looked exactly like an exchange. "She ate with him every night," Pike said. "She's the one who unlocked the records storage room on the 40th floor. Dale Kruger was summoned next, and he walked in carrying a stack of papers already clipped together, as though he had been waiting outside the door since morning. "I was planning to report this as well," he said. "Miss Marlowe has had a problem with the company for a long time." He placed on the table the complaint for unpaid overtime that Tessa had submitted to Human Resources months earlier, the complaint that had been returned with a brief note stating that the matter had been handled internally. "She believes the company owes her money. She has discussed it with several people in the department. Personally, I think that when someone believes a company has treated her unfairly, it isn't difficult to understand why she might help an outsider get inside." Sloane picked up the complaint, skimmed it, then set it down. "Terminate her employment today," she said. "Withhold her final month's wages until responsibility has been established, and include her name in the file being submitted to the attorneys." Tessa Marlowe was summoned to Human Resources at 4 o'clock that afternoon, in the middle of her morning shift at the diner, and she had to ask for half the day off to go. They read the decision to her in a flat, even voice, handed her a page to sign confirming that she had received the notice, then told her to surrender her employee badge. "What did I do wrong?" she asked. "You may file an appeal through the established process." I asked what I did wrong. The person sitting across from her lowered his eyes to the file. "I was only instructed to read the notice, Miss Marlowe." Security escorted her to the basement to collect her personal belongings and waited outside the locker room door. As she walked through the corridor for the last time, the others on the shift watched her pass, but no one said anything, because everyone understood that any one of them could be next. At the gate, someone cut a corner from her employee badge with a pair of scissors kept on the security desk. There was a small snap, and then they handed it back to her. She carried it in her hand all the way to the bus stop, without knowing what she was supposed to do with it. Rain began to fall. She sat on the bench beneath the shelter, her cloth bag resting on her lap, and the phone inside her coat pocket began to vibrate. The number belonged to Hawthorne. "Is this Miss Marlowe?" asked the nurse on the other end. "Yes." "Please forgive me for calling, but the accounting department asked me to contact you. This month's payment for your grandmother is more than 2 weeks overdue. The facility has a policy that if payment hasn't been arranged by the end of the month, we'll be required to transfer her to a public facility. The nearest one with an available bed is in another state, quite a long distance from here. Tessa opened her mouth, then closed it again. Rain tapped against the metal roof above her, steady and unhurried. "I understand," she said. "I'll find a way." There was a beat of silence on the other end. Then the nurse's voice softened and no longer sounded like the voice of the accounting department. "Oh, and she was very lucid today, Miss Marlowe. She was clear all morning. She sat outside on the porch and kept telling stories about when she worked the night shift at the hospital. Then she kept asking me the same question, over and over." "What did she ask?" "She asked whether my little Tessa was getting ready to take her nursing exams. She said you were such a good student and had only one more year before you finished. She said that when the day of your exam came, I should remember to wake her early." Tessa sat motionless. The nurse said something more about visiting hours that weekend, then ended the call. Tessa continued holding the phone to her ear long after the other end had gone silent. The bus arrived, opened its doors, waited, then closed them and drove on. She didn't stand up. Word reached Everett Donovan that evening, in a room overlooking the river, when Bridget Quinn placed the list of employees whose contracts had been terminated that day on the table and said nothing more. She simply stood there. He read it. There was only one name. He read it again, more slowly, and Bridget noticed that his hand had stopped in the middle of the page. He didn't turn it over, and he didn't set it down. She had worked beside this man for years. She had sat through negotiations in which the people across the table trembled while he poured water for them, and she had never once seen him need more than 2 seconds to react to anything. This time, he remained silent far longer than that. "They blamed her," he said. "It wasn't a question." "The loading dock camera," Bridget replied, "and a complaint for unpaid overtime that Human Resources rejected a long time ago. They used it to prove that she held a grudge against the company." Everett placed the page on the table. He didn't strike the desk, stand up, or raise his voice. He merely looked out at the river for a while, and when he turned back, there was something in his voice that Bridget had never heard before, a coldness that was no longer calm, but had acquired a sharpened edge. "She gave me half her food because she thought I had forgotten to bring something to eat," he said, "and they turned that into evidence." He took out his phone, dialed a number, and when the person on the other end answered, he offered no greeting, didn't identify himself, and didn't name the person behind the request. "I want to know everything about Dale Kruger before sunrise. Every timesheet he approved during the past 3 years. His account numbers. His relatives. The places where he spends his money. Every name he has ever crossed off the night shift list." He ended the call. Bridget looked at him. "You're letting this become personal," she said quietly. "You know that." "I know," he replied. By 6 o'clock the next morning, the file was on his desk, far thicker than anything a cleaning department manager should have accumulated. He read every page before the sky had fully brightened, then closed it, and told Bridget to find the address of the diner where the young woman worked the morning shift. The diner on the corner of Halsted opened early, and when he pushed through the door, the bell above it gave a dry little ring. He was still wearing the same dark shirt, and still carried himself like a man who had just finished a night shift, and no one inside the diner looked at him twice. Tessa was pouring coffee for a customer at the counter. She saw him, and her hand stopped. "Ev." She set down the coffee pot, glanced around, then stepped out from behind the counter. "I thought they fired you too. People said you weren't allowed inside the tower anymore." "I don't work there now," he said. She nodded, told him to sit at a table in the corner, then disappeared into the changing room in the back. When she returned, she placed an old paper envelope in front of him, the kind people use to hold their paychecks. "There are $80 in there," she said. "Tips from this morning and the past few days. It isn't much, but it might help for now." Everett didn't reach for it. "Why?" "Because they fired you because of me." She stood there with both hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. "They showed the footage from the loading dock to everyone in the conference room. They said I opened doors for you. If I hadn't shared my food with you that night, there wouldn't have been any footage, and you would still have your job." Her voice didn't tremble, but she spoke a little too quickly, like someone afraid that if she slowed down, she wouldn't manage to finish. "Do you have a family to support?" "No," he replied. "You still have rent to pay." She pushed the envelope a little closer to him. "Take it." He stared at the envelope for a very long time. The woman standing before him had just lost her job. Her wages were being withheld, and someone she loved at Hawthorne was about to be transferred because the payment hadn't been made. Yet she was offering him the last of what she had. In all his years of sitting in rooms where the air conditioning ran in quiet comfort, he had watched people fight over every fraction of a percentage point. He had watched them betray their friends to keep a seat. He had never seen anything like this. "Tessa," he said. It was the first time he had called her by name. "If tomorrow you had the power to decide the fate of the people who did this, what would you do to them?" She looked at him as though the question had come from another world. Then she truly considered it. She thought for a long time, and when she answered, her voice was very soft. "I don't want anyone to lose their job. Everyone down there has a reason for enduring what they endure." She paused. "I only want them to have to see us, that's all." In 9 years, she has never once gone down to the basement. Everett picked up the envelope carefully and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. He didn't tell her that he would preserve it exactly as it was. He simply stood, thanked her, and walked toward the door. By the time he reached his car, he knew exactly what he would do next. The review clause activated by Ironline triggered a consequence that Sloane Whitfield hadn't yet fully anticipated. An independent auditing firm now had the right to enter Meridian Sterling, open every set of books from the previous 3 years, and do so without asking permission from anyone on the executive team. The notice arrived on Thursday afternoon and stated clearly that the auditors would begin work on Monday morning. Warren Pike read the letter in his office, closed the door, and sat motionless for nearly an hour. That night, he was the last person to leave. He summoned a systems technician, the youngest person in the department, a young man who was still on probation. "The accounting server is running slowly, and it's affecting the entire tower," he said. "I need you to clear the old storage partition tonight and restore it from the baseline copy. This is an order from the executive team." The young man asked whether he needed written authorization. Pike replied that if they waited for paperwork, the entire accounting department wouldn't be able to open a single spreadsheet the next morning, and the young man nodded. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the cleanup was complete. June Callahan discovered it at 8 o'clock the following morning. When she opened the contracts folder to retrieve documents for the upcoming audit, and the screen returned a cold message stating that the contents no longer existed, she tried the backup storage. Empty. She called the systems department, and the person on duty told her that the baseline copy used for the restoration came from the previous quarter. Everything recorded after that had been overwritten and couldn't be recovered. June sat before the screen for a very long time. Then she reopened the exact file she had altered with her own hands several days earlier. The security report that now stated an unidentified individual had been found inside the building, and she realized that she was sitting in the middle of a tower where anything could be rewritten if someone with enough authority gave the order. She didn't report the discovery to anyone above her. She opened her private notebook, wrote down the time, the date, and the name of the person who had signed the order authorizing the technician's work that night, then closed the notebook and placed it in her purse. Across the city, Bridget Quinn entered Ironline's conference room at 9 o'clock that morning wearing an expression that no one seated around the table had ever seen on her face. "The addendum has disappeared," she said. No one understood immediately. She placed her computer on the table and turned the screen toward them. Addendum 3. The clause authorizing Ironline to place an internal observer inside the company before the second disbursement. Every digital copy in Meridian's system was deleted during the night. "They're calling it a technical failure." An attorney seated at the far end of the table asked where Ironline's copy was. "We have a copy of the main agreement," Bridget replied, but Addendum 3 was signed separately, on the spot, during the final meeting. There was only one original bearing the handwritten signatures of both parties, and it was inside the set of documents brought to the tower on the night of the gala. The room fell silent, the attorney continued, speaking slowly, as though he were reading a sentence handed down by a judge. "If we can't prove that addendum existed, then placing someone inside their company is no longer a contractual right. It becomes unlawful infiltration, and if Meridian has already built a case around that claim," he looked around the table, "then they won't merely be able to invalidate the second disbursement. They could overturn the entire bridge loan and put Ironline before a court." Bridget turned toward Everett. He was sitting at the head of the table and hadn't spoken since the meeting began. Both hands rested on the table, and his eyes were fixed on some point in the empty space before him. "Everett," she called. He didn't answer immediately. In his mind, he was retracing that evening one step at a time, From the moment he stepped out of the freight elevator and walked past the pedestal of white flowers, to the moment the woman in white raised her hand, he remembered leaving with nothing in his hands. He had remembered that detail for days, and kept telling himself it didn't matter. Everett Donovan rose from his chair. Everyone in the room looked up at him. He offered no explanation, and didn't apologize for interrupting the meeting. He asked only one question, and not a single person in the room understood it. "Where is my briefcase?" Bridget understood before he had even finished speaking. "You had it with you that night," she said. "You were carrying it when you entered the grand hall." "I left with empty hands," Everett replied. "I left it inside that building." Everyone in the conference room watched as he walked toward the door. There were exactly 2 things inside that leather briefcase, and neither could ever be duplicated. The first was the original signature page of Addendum 3, the only document bearing the wet ink signatures of both parties. It had been signed at the table as an addition during their final meeting, and he had intended to deliver it personally on the night of the gala, so that everything would become official. The second was the small notebook he had carried throughout the 5 weeks he spent at the bottom of the tower, the notebook in which he had written several lines in pencil every night, recording times, hallways, which doors still had lights behind them, and who remained in the building. It contained every occasion when Warren Pike had entered and left the record storage room on the 40th floor at hours when no chief financial officer had any reason to be there. Bridget had people review the lost property records from the hospitality department, the event organizers, and the tower's security division. There was nothing. By afternoon, Everett told her to stop. "Don't ask anyone in the building again," he said. "If it had fallen into the hands of someone on the executive team, I would already be standing before a court. It's still somewhere, and the person holding it hasn't opened it." He sat silently for a moment. Who was still in the grand hall that night after I was taken outside? The rooming house occupied the 3rd floor of an old building on the west side, with a narrow hallway and yellow lights, and it was already dark when Everett knocked on the door. Tessa opened it with the security chain still fastened, peered through the gap, then removed the chain. "Ev." She looked past him toward the stairs. "Is something wrong? I need to ask you something," he said. "On the night of the gala, after I was taken outside, did you see a leather briefcase?" Tessa straightened. "Yes." Then she continued more quickly, like someone who had suddenly been relieved of a burden she had carried for too long. "Was it yours? I called after you, but the door had already closed. I thought some guest had forgotten it." She turned back inside to get her coat and keys. "I locked it in my locker in the basement. I recorded it properly in the shift log, and clearly wrote that it had been found in the grand hall and would be returned when someone came to claim it." She stopped with one arm halfway into her coat. "But they fired me. They cut my badge at the gate." Everett looked at her. "Do you still have the key to your locker?" "Yes. They only took my access badge. No one thought about the locker." He drove her to the rear entrance of the tower, beside the loading dock, where Otis Reed was working the night shift. Otis saw the 2 of them step out of the car, looked at Tessa, then at the man walking beside her, and rose from his chair at the security desk. "I only need to get something from my locker, Mr. Reed," Tessa said. "My personal property. You can come with me if you want." Otis studied them for another beat. Then he reached for the ring of keys hanging from its hook and opened the door. "Be quick," he said. The basement still held its familiar smell of soap and damp air. Tessa unlocked her locker, bent toward the bottom compartment, and lifted out the leather briefcase with both hands, exactly as she had placed it there that night. She brushed a thin layer of dust from the lid and handed it to him. "It's untouched," she said. "I didn't open it. It belonged to someone else, so it wasn't my business." Everett took it. Throughout this tower, people had wiped an entire server clean during the night, rewritten a report, and constructed a complete case to place the blame on someone else. Yet the thing preserving the legal existence of the entire loan that kept 4,000 people employed had been lying inside a metal locker in the basement, locked away by a woman who had just been fired, a woman who had recorded it in the shift log and signed her name underneath. He unlocked the briefcase and examined its contents beneath the hallway light. The page bearing the wet ink signatures was still there. The notebook with the hard cover was still there. He closed the briefcase. "Is it very important?" Tessa asked. Everett looked at her and thought about how completely unaware she was of what she had just done, and how, if she had looked down that night and walked away like everyone else in the grand hall, everything would have ended long ago. Yes, he said. Far more important than you realize. She nodded and didn't ask anything more, because that was simply the kind of person she was. But as they walked up from the basement, he stopped on the final step. Tessa, I owe you an explanation. She turned and looked at him. But not today, he said. For 3 days in a row, letters from Meridian Sterling arrived at the offices of Iron Line Capital, one each day, and each written in a different voice. The first was drafted by the legal department, long and formal, requesting a meeting to clarify the issues that had arisen. The second was shorter, signed by Sloane Whitfield, and used the word misunderstanding 3 times on a single page. The third contained only 4 handwritten lines, and she didn't mention the loan once. Bridget brought in all 3 letters and placed them before him. Are you going to meet with her? Everett read the last letter, then folded it. Yes. Here or at the attorney's office? Neither, he said. Tell her to come to the mechanical basement of her own building. 7 o'clock tonight. She is to take the freight elevator. Bridget looked up. She started to say something, then decided against it. At 7 o'clock that evening, Sloane Whitfield stood before the freight elevator at the rear of her own tower. And it took her a moment to find the button because it was lower than she had expected, close to the edge of the wall, where someone could press it with an elbow while both hands were occupied pushing a cart. The elevator descended slowly, trembling as it went, and the doors opened onto a corridor that smelled of industrial soap and damp air. She passed the employee locker room, its door partly open. Inside stood 2 rows of blue metal lockers with peeling paint. A mirror cracked at one corner, and a yellowing printed notice taped to the wall, stating that night shift employees were not to use the main elevators under any circumstances. She read the words and couldn't remember whether she had ever approved that rule. At the end of the corridor was the shift break room, containing a plastic table, a wall fan that didn't turn, and Everett Donovan sitting with the leather briefcase resting on his lap. He didn't stand. He merely tipped his chin toward the chair across from him, a blue plastic chair with one broken leg propped up by a wooden wedge. Sloane sat down. The chair tilted slightly beneath her weight, and she had to brace one hand against the table to steady herself. 9 years, Everett said. You've never been down here once. Mr. Donovan, she began. I didn't come here to defend myself. Good. He opened the briefcase and placed 3 pages on the plastic table, one at a time, without hurry. The first was the original security report, untouched by anyone. The second was a timesheet with places that had been erased and written over, the marks still pressed into the paper. The third was the notice terminating Tessa Marlowe's employment. Sloane looked at the 3 pages lying there. She didn't pick up any of them. I can correct all of this, she said. I can reinstate her employment tomorrow, pay every dollar she is owed, and issue a public correction. I can have every timesheet from the past 3 years reviewed and repay every cent. Whatever figure you name, I'll accept it. Everett leaned back against the wall. You're still bargaining. I'm trying to save 4,000 jobs. No. He said the word gently, and its gentleness was what gave it such weight. You're trying to save the version of the story in which you are the victim. You constructed it very quickly. I'll give you that. An investment fund planted someone inside the tower. A resentful employee helped him. In that story, what you did in the grand hall that night becomes nothing more than a minor detail. Sloane didn't answer. My condition isn't money, Everett said. I don't need you to compensate me a single dollar. I need you to stand before every one of your employees, all of them, including the night shift, and tell them exactly what happened. Not a statement written by the communications department. You may not use the word misunderstanding. You may not use the words regrettable incident. You will say that you trusted a uniform before you trusted the person wearing it, and you will say that afterward you ordered the records to be altered. You will say it with your own mouth, in front of them. She sat in silence for a very long time inside the room with the motionless wall fan. Out in the corridor, the wheels of a cart rolled past as someone began a shift. Do you know what that will cost me? She asked. I do. And if I do all of it? She raised her eyes to him. Will you believe that I've changed? Everett Donovan closed the leather briefcase and stood. I don't believe words, he replied. I believe records that have been corrected, decisions that have been reversed, and people who were falsely written about being given the right to rewrite their own stories. Do it. Then I'll read. It took 4 days for the hardbound notebook inside the leather briefcase to become something else. Bridget matched every penciled line against the access logs from the keycard system, then compared them with the transactions the legal team had uncovered through shell companies registered in 3 different states. On Friday morning, she placed the completed report on the table and pointed to the name at the end of the chain. "Warren Pike isn't a bad chief financial officer," she said. "He's a very good chief financial officer. He has been siphoning money out of Meridian for 2 years, in small installments, through fictitious service contracts, and every piece of the company's internal data was sent outside, week after week." "Sent to whom?" Everett asked, though he knew the answer before she opened her mouth. "Gideon Voss." He nodded slowly. Voss had been waiting for Meridian to collapse for a long time, waiting for the day the company lost its liquidity so he could buy its remains for the price of scrap metal, and more importantly, drive Iron Line out of Chicago after years of failing to win a single contest against the Donovan family. "There's one more thing," Bridget said. "The loan agreement contains the internal observer clause." Pike knew the clause existed. He didn't know who the observer was, but he knew someone was inside the building, and because he was stealing money, he panicked. He was the one who told Miss Whitfield that the night shift janitor who kept wandering near the records storage room was a spy. Bridget paused. He set all of this in motion, and he has no idea whom he just threw into the fire. Everett remained silent for a while. Then he told her to reserve the table at the old restaurant on Wentworth Street, on the south side of the city, where his grandfather had once sat every Tuesday evening when the entire family had nothing but a name. The restaurant was still there, still covered its tables with checkered cloths, and the elderly owner still came all the way to the door to greet him. In the back room, there was only one table. Gideon Voss arrived 10 minutes late, exactly like a man who wanted the other person to know that he wasn't anxious. He sat down, unfolded his napkin, and smiled. "It has been a long time since a Donovan invited me to dinner. Your grandfather never invited me. He only sat and watched. He taught me that if you have to speak with someone, it's best to offer him a meal," Everett replied. "People have a harder time lying when they're holding a fork." The appetizer was brought out. They talked about the weather, a trade fair in Milwaukee, and office rents in the Loop. Then Everett set down his fork, opened the leather briefcase beside his chair, and slowly began placing documents on the table one at a time, between the plates. The first was the registration record for a shell company in Delaware, signed by a representative Voss had used for many years. Voss glanced down, and his smile remained intact. The second was a record of a meeting that no one was supposed to have documented, complete with the date and the names of those present. His smile faded slightly. Everett placed the third page on the table without saying anything, and Voss studied it longer than the first 2 combined. "My grandfather kept these," Everett said, his voice still sounding as though he were discussing office rents. "He didn't use them. He said that if you keep something safe for another person, one day that person may need it." Voss placed one hand on the edge of the table. "What do you want?" "I haven't said I want anything." Everett poured more water into Voss's glass. "I only invited you to dinner. The main course will be out soon." The elderly owner passed the doorway to the back room, glanced inside, then quietly withdrew. Voss remained seated for another half-minute. Then he folded his napkin, placed it on the table, and stood. "I have business to attend to." "You haven't eaten anything?" Everett said. "Thank you," Voss replied, and he walked out without looking back. Everett remained alone in the room with its checkered tablecloth. He didn't touch the 3 documents. He simply sat there until the main course arrived, then asked the server to wrap it so he could take it home. As he walked toward his car, his phone vibrated. "Bridget, have you left yet?" Her voice was tense. "Dale Kruger. A transfer reached his account this afternoon from one of the shell companies we just traced. Our people obtained the contents of the exchange." "What did he sell?" Bridget was silent for a beat. "He didn't sell documents. He sold a name." Everett stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. Wind moved along Wentworth Street, and he heard her voice with perfect clarity on the other end of the line. The young woman's name, Everett. He told them that if they wanted to destroy Iron Line's legal standing, all they needed was one signature, and the person whose signature they needed was named Tessa Marlowe. Since losing her job at the tower, Tessa had taken an additional evening shift at a laundromat 4 bus stops from her room, and that night she left the shop close to midnight beneath the first cold rain of the season. She was alone at the bus stop. She sat on the bench beneath the shelter, placed her cloth bag on her lap, and looked at the electronic sign announcing that the final bus would arrive in 10 minutes. A car pulled over to the curb with its headlights still shining. 3 men stepped out. They didn't come too close. They stopped several paces from the bench, and the man in the middle unbuttoned his coat and smiled as though they had arranged to meet. "Miss Marlowe?" Tessa stood. "Don't worry. We won't take much of your time." He drew a carefully clipped stack of papers and a pen from inside his coat. "We work for a law office. There's a matter involving the place where you used to work, and you are the most important witness." He held out the papers. "You only need to confirm one thing: that the man entered the records storage room on the 40th floor without authorization, that you unlocked the door because he asked you to, and that you didn't know who he was." Tessa didn't take them. "I didn't unlock the door for anyone. That was part of my job every night. I signed the log properly." "Exactly." He nodded, still smiling. "Your signature appears in that log every night for 5 consecutive weeks. You were the only person who opened that door. So all you need to say is that he had no right to enter, and everything he obtained from inside becomes unlawful. You understand. All it takes is one signature." The man on the left spoke, his voice gentler, almost caring. "We looked into your circumstances. Hawthorne. The payment is more than 2 weeks overdue. At the end of the month, they'll transfer your grandmother, and the only available bed is in another state." He paused at precisely the right place. "Our people are prepared to pay everything. Not for 1 month. Everything. For as long as she remains there. You'll never have to receive another call like that again." Rain fell steadily against the metal roof. Tessa looked at the papers in his hand, then at the pen. She thought of the hallway lined with rocking chairs where no one sat at this time of year. She thought of the woman in the last room, of the mornings when her mind was clear and she asked whether her granddaughter was preparing for her exams. She thought about how simply reaching out her hand would make every call from Hawthorne stop forever. "He didn't ask me to open the door," she said. "I know, but paperwork only records what is written down, Miss Marlowe." "No." She said the word softly, but she didn't step back. "My parents died when I was 12. They called me out of class. And I never had the chance to say a single word to either of them. I've thought about that almost every day since." Her voice trembled slightly, then grew steady again. "I don't have much. I don't own a home. I don't have a degree, and I don't have anyone to call when something goes wrong. All I have is knowing what I did and what I didn't do. If I sign that page, I'll have to live the rest of my life with a lying signature. Take your money and go." The man in the middle stopped smiling. He didn't move closer, but he spoke more slowly. "You should think carefully. An opportunity like this won't come a second time." "My bus is here," Tessa said, but the bus hadn't arrived. What came first were 3 dark cars, pulling over one after another behind them and parking in a line. No one stepped out except one man. Everett Donovan walked around the front of the first car and stopped in the middle of the wet sidewalk, close enough to the 3 men that no one needed to raise his voice. He didn't look at the papers. He didn't ask what was happening. He only looked at the man in the middle. "Tell him that my family still believes in courtesy," Everett said, "but this is where it ends." No one answered. The man on the left glanced toward their car. The man in the middle folded the papers, slipped them inside his coat, and all 3 turned away. The car doors closed. Headlights swept across the wet pavement, then vanished at the end of the street. Only the sound of the rain remained. Everett turned toward her. "Are you all right?" Tessa didn't answer immediately. She was looking at the 3 cars parked in a line behind him, at the dark windows and the people sitting inside who hadn't stepped out, and at the way the man who had approached her had fallen silent because of a single sentence. Then she looked at Everett, the quiet man who had once sat with her on a concrete step at 2 o'clock in the morning and eaten half a box of cold food. "Ev," she said. She took 1 step back. He drove her home, and throughout the journey she didn't say a word. She only looked through the window as the city drifted past in the rain. When they reached the old building on the west side, she opened the car door, stepped out, then stopped on the sidewalk. "Come upstairs," she said. "I have some questions." The room on the 3rd floor contained only a small table, a bed pushed against the wall, and a wooden chair that she pulled out for him. She didn't sit. She stood against the sink with her arms folded across her chest, and she asked him directly, "Who are you?" "Everett Donovan." "I've heard that name. On the night of the gala, Miss Whitfield called you someone who didn't belong in that room, but those men said your name in a very different voice." She looked at him. 3 cars pulled up because of 1 sentence from you. What do you do? I run Iron Line Capital, he replied. The fund that is lending money to Meridian Sterling. She nodded slowly, as though she had known already and had only been waiting to hear him say it aloud. Then what were those 5 weeks? Everett didn't avoid the question. My family has a principle. Before we give someone money, we see how they treat the person who cleans their floors. I went down there to observe that company's executive team from below, because from above, they would only show me what they wanted me to see. So you wore our uniform? Yes. You signed the assignment sheets. You pushed a cart. You sat and ate with us on the loading dock. Her voice remained even, and its evenness was what made it so difficult to hear. That night when you said you had forgotten to bring food, had you really forgotten? He was silent for a beat. No. Tessa turned her face away. She stared through the small window with its curtain partly drawn, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed. I gave you half my food because I thought you were hungry. I sat there and told you about my grandmother. I picked up your briefcase and locked it in my locker because I thought someone would come looking for it. She turned back. And all that time, you were judging us. Tessa, do you know what I lost because of what happened at 2 o'clock that morning? They showed that footage to an entire conference room. They called me an accomplice. They cut my badge at the gate. Her eyes reddened, but she didn't cry. Then, 3 men came to the bus stop at midnight, and they knew the name of my grandmother's nursing home. They even knew how much money was overdue. All of that happened because I was kind to a man who turned out not to need anyone's kindness at all. Everett remained seated on the wooden chair. He could have told her that he had ordered every flow of money stopped that same night, because of her, that the envelope containing $80 was still untouched inside his coat, that he hadn't slept since seeing her name on the termination list. But he knew those words would only ease his own heart, and do nothing to ease hers. And he had lived long enough to know that the worst thing anyone could do to a person in pain was force them to sit and listen while he defended himself. You're right, he said. I went down there to test other people. He paused. But the person who was tested turned out to be me. She looked at him. I thought I was going down there to see how they treated the person who cleaned their floors, he said. The first night you pushed half your food toward me, I sat there and didn't know what to do with it. In all these years, no one had ever given me anything without first calculating what they would receive in return. I covered my name badge with my sleeve so you wouldn't ask any more questions. That wasn't part of the role anymore. That was me feeling ashamed. He stood. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I only want you to know that you weren't a test. You were the only person in that building who did the right thing when no one was watching, even when no one paid you to do it. Tessa stood motionless for a very long time. Outside the window, the rain had begun to ease. You should go, she said. Tessa, I'm very tired. I have to get up early tomorrow. He picked up his coat and walked toward the door. He stopped at the threshold, but she no longer looked at him. The door closed behind him, and the security chain made a dry metallic sound. Everett Donovan stood in the yellow-lit hallway of an old building on the west side of Chicago, and for the first time in his life, he had met someone who refused him, and there was no price he could pay to undo it. The communications department submitted its draft on Tuesday afternoon, 11 pages complete with a title and an opening section about the organization's 9-year journey and the values it had always upheld. June Callahan read it from beginning to end, then carried it back to Sloane Whitfield's desk without marking a single word. Well? Sloane asked. Which sentence in here says that you trusted the uniform before you trusted the person? June placed the pages on the desk. I've read it twice. There isn't one. Sloane looked at her assistant, the woman who had worked beside her for nearly 4 years and had never spoken more than 3 consecutive sentences to her. Is there anything else you want to say? Yes, June replied. I was the person who altered that report. I sat in front of the screen and typed every word you dictated. If you stand up there and call this a misunderstanding, then I become part of that lie too, and I don't want that anymore. Sloane didn't respond. That night, she remained in her office, deleted the communications department's entire file, and began writing by hand. On Thursday morning, the large auditorium on the 2nd floor was filled to capacity. There was no additional stage, no opening music, and no film reviewing the milestones of the company. There was only a wooden podium, a microphone, and straight rows of chairs. Offices in other states joined through a live broadcast. The night shift was required to attend and was paid for that morning, something that hadn't happened once in 9 years. Sloane Whitfield stepped up to the podium carrying 6 handwritten pages. She didn't thank anyone. She didn't speak about the journey. She began with the first line. On the night of the gala, a man stood in the grand hall of this building. He had a name. He had a legitimate reason to be there. I didn't ask his name, and I didn't ask his reason. She raised her eyes from the page. I looked at the uniform he was wearing, and in less time than it takes to draw a breath, I decided that he didn't belong in that room. Then I raised my hand and called security. The auditorium was so quiet that the sound of the projector could be heard. Afterward, I did something worse. She continued. I ordered the security report from that night to be altered so the record would say what I wanted it to say, rather than what had actually happened. I instructed my assistant to do it. She obeyed because I'm the person who pays her salary. The responsibility is mine. She turned the page. I also signed the decision terminating a member of the night cleaning staff, based on footage of her sharing her food with a coworker and an unpaid overtime complaint that I should have regarded as an accusation against this company, not evidence of resentment toward it. I signed that decision without meeting her even once. In the middle rows, someone began to sit straighter. She continued, reading every line she had written herself during the night, and when she reached the end of the final page, she placed all 6 sheets on the podium and looked up. I'll take questions. No one raised a hand for nearly half a minute. Then a man in the row on the left stood. His employee badge identified him as a member of the engineering department, and he had probably worked in the tower longer than she had. May I ask you directly, ma'am? Yes. The man from that night controls the loan, keeping everyone in this room employed. If he didn't control that money, if he had truly been nothing more than a man who cleaned floors, would you be standing up there this morning? Sloane Whitfield looked down at him. She could have spoken about growth, about lessons learned, about how deeply she had reflected during the past several days. She had rehearsed those sentences in her mind throughout the night. No, she said. Not a sound moved through the auditorium. If he had only been a man who cleaned floors, I would have forgotten his face by the next morning, she said. That is the worst thing I know about myself, and there is nothing I can say to make it sound less terrible. She announced that she would leave her executive position within 6 weeks, would take no part in selecting her successor, and had declined the entire transition payment provided under her contract. She didn't ask anyone to forgive her. When she stepped down, there was no applause. People rose one by one, gathered their chairs, and left through the side aisles, speaking quietly among themselves. In the last row against the wall, where additional chairs had been placed for those who arrived late, Tessa Marlowe remained seated. She had received the invitation by mail at the address of her rooming house, 3 lines signed by Human Resources. The crowd emptied out, half the ceiling lights were turned off, and she still sat there with both hands resting on her lap, looking at the wooden podium that now stood empty. The review of 3 years of timesheets was assigned to an outside firm, and they finished sooner than expected, because the places where figures had been erased and written over were pressed so clearly into the paper that no expert was needed. The letter arrived at Tessa's room at the end of the following week, accompanied by a decision reinstating her employment, a correction placed in her personnel file stating clearly that her previous termination had been without basis, and a check. She sat on the edge of her bed with the check in her hands, reading the line describing the purpose of payment again and again. Reimbursement for unpaid overtime. It was her money, not money someone had given her. It came from the nights she had stood cleaning the hallways on the 40th floor, after spending the entire morning on her feet at the diner, the nights she had signed timesheets with missing hours using the pen Kruger pushed toward her. She had believed that money was gone, and had grown accustomed to believing it. On Saturday morning, she took the bus to Hawthorne with the envelope in her bag. She went directly to the administrative desk, placed the envelope on the counter, and said she wanted to pay the entire outstanding balance, along with the next 3 months if possible. The woman behind the counter opened the account, typed several lines, then looked up at her in confusion. Miss Marlowe, your grandmother's account has no outstanding balance. Yes, it does. Your office called me. It was more than 2 weeks overdue, and there was the matter of transferring her. That amount has already been paid, not only the overdue balance, but a long period beyond it as well. She turned the screen slightly toward Tessa. Someone came in and paid it personally, in cash. Who? There is no name. The person only said the payment was for Mrs. Marlowe in the last room at the end of the hallway, then left. We asked for a name for the receipt, but they wouldn't provide one. Tessa stood there holding the envelope containing her own money, and the first thing she felt wasn't relief. It was a rush of heat traveling down her spine. She thought about the cars parked in a line beneath the rain. She thought about a man who could make 3 people leave with a single sentence, and who had now gone behind her back to pay for her grandmother, as though everything in the world could be quietly arranged without anyone knowing. She walked outside, took out her phone, and called him. "Can you meet me?" she said. "Now." They met at the coffee shop near the bus station, and she placed the envelope on the table before he had time to sit. "Take it back." Everett looked at the envelope, then at her. "What is this?" "My grandmother's care. Whatever you paid, I'll repay you. If this isn't enough, I'll work more hours and send the rest later. But don't ever do something like this again." She spoke quickly, her face growing red. "I don't need anyone standing behind me and arranging my life. I can take care of my grandmother. I've been doing it for 6 years. He didn't reach for the envelope. "Tessa," he said, "I didn't pay a single dollar." She stopped. "Are you telling me the truth?" "I knew you wouldn't accept it," he replied. "You returned my briefcase without opening it. You offered me $80 when you had nothing yourself. Someone like that would never accept money from me." He paused. "I intended to pay it. I admit that. Then I didn't, because I realized that if I did, I would be no different from those other people, believing everything could be solved by spending money without asking whether anyone wanted it." Tessa lowered herself into the chair very slowly. "Then who was it?" She found out that afternoon, when she returned to Hawthorne and questioned the woman at the desk more carefully, asking about the person's build, voice, and the exact date and time. Then she waited in the lobby of Meridian Sterling Tower at the end of the workday. And when June Callahan stepped out of the main elevator, Tessa was standing there. June saw her and stopped. "It was you," Tessa said. June didn't deny it. She merely looked down at the floor for a moment, then spoke quietly. "I received a year-end bonus. I didn't know what else to do with it." "Why did you do that?" June raised her eyes, and they were red. "Because I was the person who rewrote that report," she said. "I sat there knowing exactly what the truth was, and I typed it anyway. Then, several days later, I saw your name on the termination list, and I realized that the report I had typed had cleared the way for what happened to you. I couldn't sleep, Miss Marlowe. I kept thinking about how you had lost your job while I was still sitting safely in mine." The 2 women sat together on the stone bench outside the lobby until darkness fell, and Tessa listened as June told her about the morning she had carried the draft back to Sloane's desk. On the bus ride home that night, Tessa still carried the envelope containing her own money inside her coat pocket, and she realized something she had forgotten during the past several weeks. Not every act of kindness came from someone with power. Some came from people who had nothing in their hands except a year-end bonus and a sleepless night. June left first, and Tessa said she still wanted to go up to the 2nd floor to retrieve the coat she had forgotten in the auditorium that morning. The auditorium door was still partly open. Most of the ceiling lights had been turned off, leaving only the 2 rows nearest the walls, and in that dim light, a woman sat in the front row, not on the stage but below it, her hands resting on her lap as she stared at the empty wooden podium. Tessa started to step back, but Sloane Whitfield turned around. "Miss Marlowe." Tessa stopped in the center aisle. "I came to get my coat. Could you sit down?" She gestured toward the row beside her, and her voice no longer carried the tone she used in meetings. "Only for a moment. Then I won't trouble you again." Tessa sat down 2 chairs away from her. "This morning, I stood up there and said everything I needed to say," Sloane began, "but there was one thing I didn't say. I had intended to carry it with me for the rest of my life." She looked toward the window at the far end of the room. "My mother once worked the night shift in this office complex, not in the tower that stands here now, but in the old building that was demolished to build this one. She cleaned the hallways, emptied trash cans, and rode the freight elevator in the back. She worked there until I went to college." Tessa turned and looked at her. "I went to school with the money she earned from nights like those," Sloane continued. "Then I began applying for jobs. During my first interview, someone asked what my family did, and I heard myself say that my mother was an administrative manager. The words left my mouth before I even had time to think." She clasped her hands tightly together. "After that, I kept giving the same answer. For 20 years. I told it to coworkers, business partners, and the board of directors. I told it so many times that there were moments when I believed it was true. When my mother died, I arranged a small funeral. And even in her obituary, I still didn't write the truth about the work she had done. The auditorium was silent. People think I look down on those who clean floors because I was never one of them. Sloane said. That isn't true. I looked down on them because I was afraid. Every time I passed someone wearing that uniform, I saw the old building again. I saw my mother standing at the end of a hallway at 11 o'clock at night. I was afraid someone would look at me and recognize where I had come from, so I didn't look at them. I walked past as quickly as I could. She turned toward Tessa. That night, when I raised my hand and pointed toward the door, I wasn't thinking about him. I was pushing something of my own out of the room. Tessa sat in silence for a very long time. She thought about the employee badge with its corner cut away, the phone call beneath the rain, and the 3 men who knew the name of her grandmother's nursing home. Nothing she had just heard made any part of those things less painful. Why are you telling me this? She asked. I don't know, Sloane answered honestly. Perhaps because you were the only person who remained seated in this room this morning. She raised one hand to her face, and her shoulders trembled once, only once, before she struggled to hold herself still. Tessa opened her cloth bag, removed a neatly folded handkerchief, the kind her grandmother still hemmed by hand, and held it out to her. Sloane looked at the handkerchief for a moment before accepting it. I don't forgive you, Tessa said. Her voice was calm, without the slightest trace of hatred, and that was what made it true. I lost my job. My grandmother was almost transferred away. People came looking for me at midnight because my name had been placed in a case file. Those things don't disappear simply because I understand you better now. Sloane nodded. I know, but I want to tell you something. Tessa turned and looked directly at her. My grandmother worked the night shift too. She worked as a night nurse for almost her entire life. Now there are days when she doesn't remember who I am, but she has never forgotten what she did for a living. She talks about those shifts as though they were the finest thing she ever had. She paused. Your mother worked nights so you could go to school. That woman certainly wasn't ashamed of what she did. You were the one who was ashamed. Sloane Whitfield sat perfectly still, the handkerchief held in her palm. Tessa stood, retrieved the coat draped over the chair at the end of the row, and walked out. At the door, she stopped for a beat without turning around. You can keep the handkerchief, she said. Then she walked down the stairs, leaving the woman who had once worn white sitting alone in the darkened auditorium of the tower she had led for 9 years. That Sunday was a lucid day. Tessa knew it the moment she entered the room, because her grandmother was sitting beside the window and called her name before she had time to say hello. They sat together for nearly the entire morning, and close to noon, her grandmother told her to pull out the tin box beneath the cabinet. I've kept it all this time and never given it to you, she said. Old people keep saving things, and one day they forget what they were saving them for. Inside the box were several yellowed photographs, a bracelet that had belonged to Tessa's mother, an old hospital employee badge, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a cloth, a metal pocket watch that had tarnished with age. A thin crack ran across its glass, and one link in the chain was broken. Tessa turned it over. Words had been engraved on the back in rough strokes, the kind of work done by hand in a small shop along the street, and she had to tilt it toward the light to read them. One short line offered thanks, and beneath it was a name, Donovan. She sat motionless. Grandma, she said, where did this come from? Her grandmother took the watch, turned it in her palm, and smiled the way people smile at something that happened a very long time ago. It belonged to an old man. When I was young, fresh out of school, I worked the night shift on the south side of the city. There was a doorman who collapsed in the hallway close to dawn. No one else was there, and they called me down. I did what I knew how to do, then sat beside him until the ambulance came. She shrugged. He didn't have insurance. He had nothing. I never received a single dollar afterward either. Who would take money from someone in circumstances like that? What happened then? Several months later, he came back looking for me and brought this. I told him I wouldn't take it, but he left it at the desk and disappeared. She returned the watch to Tessa. I left that hospital at the end of the year. I never saw him again. Tessa rode the bus back into the city with the watch in her coat pocket, but she didn't go home. She went directly to the offices of Iron Line Capital, a gray stone building without a sign in the South Loop, and told the person at the desk that she needed to see Everett Donovan. She didn't have an appointment, and she would wait as long as necessary. She waited less than 10 minutes. When he came out, she stood and didn't greet him. What was your grandfather's name? Everett stopped in the middle of the lobby. Why are you asking? Just answer me. He told her the name. Tessa removed the watch from her coat pocket and placed it on the table beside them, with the engraved side facing upward. Everett looked at it. He didn't reach for it immediately. He stared for so long that Bridget Quinn, who was crossing the lobby with a stack of files in her hands, stopped and looked as well. Then he picked up the watch, turned the engraving toward the light, and when he spoke, his voice sounded unlike anything Tessa had ever heard from him. Where did you get this? It belonged to my grandmother, Tessa said. She told me a doorman collapsed in a hallway close to dawn, and she sat with him until the ambulance arrived. She didn't take a single cent. Several months later, he returned, left this at the desk, and walked away. Everett lowered himself into the nearest chair. He sat the way a person sits when his legs can no longer hold him. My grandfather searched for her for the rest of his life, he said. He didn't know her name. Back then, no one gave names to anyone. She worked the night shift, and that was all he remembered. He returned to the hospital several times, but they told him the nurse had left. He placed notices in the local newspaper. He told the story to my father, and my father told it to me. He placed the watch on the table very gently. He never found her, so instead of leaving us a name, he left us a principle. Never give money to a man until you've seen how he treats the person who cleans his floors. Everything my family has today began on that night. If your grandmother had walked away, my grandfather wouldn't have lived, and none of us would be sitting here. Tessa stood motionless in the middle of the lobby. Bridget placed the files on the table and stepped closer. Miss Marlowe, she said. There's something I think you should know now. They both turned toward her. After the elder Mr. Donovan survived that night, he quietly paid for the education of many children of night shift workers, Bridget said. My mother was one of those children. He covered her schooling through all those years, asking nothing in return and telling no one. She looked at Everett, then at Tessa. I don't work here for the salary. For a while no one spoke. In the lobby of the gray stone building without a sign, 3 people stood around a broken watch, and Tessa looked down at the tiny object her grandmother had kept for so many years inside a tin box beneath a cabinet, without ever believing it was worth anything. This entire empire, the cars parked in a line beneath the rain, the rooms where people lowered their voices when speaking a certain name, all of it had risen from one night shift, when a young nurse had chosen to remain beside a man no one knew. The anger Tessa had carried for weeks suddenly had nowhere left to rest. Tessa applied to return to school at the end of that month. The nursing school still had her old records. The 2 years she had completed remained fully valid, and they told her that she only needed to pass the entrance examination for returning students to resume the program exactly where she had left it. The examination was scheduled for Saturday morning. Every night after her shift at the laundromat, she studied at the small table in her room with a book borrowed from the library, and she promised herself that this time she would see it through to the end. Then Hawthorne called on Friday afternoon. Her grandmother had developed pneumonia and had been transferred to the county hospital, and they advised the family to come. Tessa arrived at 7 o'clock that evening. Her grandmother lay there breathing through an oxygen tube, her eyes closed and one frail hand resting on the thin blanket. The doctor said her condition had stabilized and the antibiotics were beginning to work, but that night would be critical, and they would know more by morning. Tessa sat down in the plastic chair beside the bed and remained there until some of the lights in the hallway were turned off. She sent Everett one brief message because during the previous several weeks they had exchanged a few ordinary messages. A question about her grandmother's health, a few words of encouragement before the examination. He arrived close to 10 o'clock. He brought no one with him, didn't question any doctors, and didn't call anyone to make arrangements. He simply pulled out the second plastic chair and sat down on the other side of the bed. What time is your examination tomorrow? 8 o'clock in the morning, Tessa said. But I'm not going. She said it calmly, as though the decision had already been made. I can't leave my grandmother alone tonight to take an examination. I'll take it again next term. Next year, if necessary. Everett looked at the woman lying in the bed for a long time. Do you know what your grandmother sacrificed so you could sit in that examination room tomorrow? He asked. She worked the night shift for nearly her entire life. She raised you from the time you were 12. She has spent 6 years at Hawthorne, and every time her mind becomes clear, she asks whether her granddaughter is preparing for her examination. She even asked a nurse she didn't know. He turned toward Tessa. If she wakes tomorrow morning and learns that you missed the examination because of her, How do you think she'll feel?" Tessa didn't answer. "Let me stay tonight," he said. "Go home and sleep for a few hours. Take the examination in the morning, then come straight back here when you finish. You don't have to do that." "I do." He said it softly. "Many years ago, during a night shift, your grandmother remained beside my grandfather when no one required her to stay. If she had walked away that night, I wouldn't be here now. There would be no iron line. There would be nothing. My family owes her one night shift. Consider tonight my repayment." Tessa looked at him across the hospital bed and realized that this man wasn't offering her charity. He was asking her permission. She returned home close to midnight and believed she wouldn't be able to sleep. But she drifted off the moment she lay down. On Saturday morning, she sat in the examination room for 3 hours, and there were moments when her hand trembled over the paper. But everything she had learned 6 years earlier was still there, and no book could teach what she had learned during the nights spent beside her grandmother's bed. She submitted her work before the allotted time. She ran 2 blocks, caught a bus, and reached the 3rd floor of the hospital close to noon, with the confirmation sheet in her hand. The door to the room was partly open. Her grandmother was awake. She was sitting against the pillows. The oxygen tube had been removed, and although her face remained pale, her eyes were open as she spoke to the man beside her. Everett Donovan was still sitting in the same hard plastic chair from the previous night, his coat draped across its back. He hadn't left for a single minute. "Grandma," Tessa said. Her grandmother turned, and her eyes brightened in the way they did only on lucid days. "Are you back from your examination?" Tessa stepped forward, knelt beside the bed, and placed the paper in her grandmother's palm. Her grandmother took it, held it a little farther away so she could see it clearly, and read it very slowly. Then she lowered the paper onto the blanket and stroked her granddaughter's hair, as she had when Tessa was a child. "I knew it," she said. "I've forgotten so many things. But I've never forgotten that you could do this." Bridget carried the entire file to the federal prosecutor's office on a Monday morning, and she entered through the front door with an appointment and a receipt. Dale Kruger was arrested that same week inside the glass office with the rattling table fan, and they escorted him through the exact hallway where he had once stood, reading the names of those who would be removed from the night shift list. Warren Pike held out for several more days before his own attorney advised him to cooperate. Bridget asked Everett whether he wanted anything more done to either of them. "No," Everett replied. "Some people aren't worth dirtying your hands over. Let the law do its work." As for Gideon Voss, Everett arranged to meet him in the marble grand hall of Meridian Sterling Tower in the middle of the afternoon, when the building was at its busiest. No private room, no dining table. Only 2 chairs beside the large window overlooking the river, where everyone passing by could see them. Voss arrived on time, and this time he wasn't smiling. "This is rather exposed." "It seems appropriate to me," Everett said. "This is where it began." Voss sat down and fastened his coat button. "Say whatever you brought me here to say." "The secondary debt you purchased from Meridian no longer has any value. It was signed by a chief financial officer who is now under investigation, based on figures he falsified himself and then sent outside the company. Your attorneys have probably told you that already." "They have." "Then you know you have nothing left in this city." Voss looked out at the river. "Are you planning to take me to court?" "I haven't decided," Everett said. "That's why I asked you to come." He sat upright with both hands resting on his thighs, and his voice remained as calm as it had been when discussing office rents in the Loop. "You have 2 ways to leave Chicago. The first is the way of the law. You submit the records yourself, liquidate the companies held in other people's names yourself, and leave before anyone has to come looking for you. There will be newspaper articles. There will be several unpleasant years. But you'll keep your name, and your son will still be able to sign that name beneath a contract in another state." He paused. "The second is my family's way." Voss turned toward him. Everett said nothing more about the second way. He simply sat there looking at him, while the grand hall filled with the sound of shoes crossing marble, elevators opening and closing, and someone laughing near the reception desk. "You intend to frighten me with your grandfather's reputation?" Voss asked. But his voice had lost its original sharpness. "My grandfather never threatened anyone," Everett replied. "He only kept documents. He said that everyone leaves a trail, and if you take the trouble to gather each piece, you'll have enough when the time comes. He kept 3 pages for you, the ones I showed you that night. I've kept more than 3. Voss was silent. "I advise you to choose the first way," Everett said. Not because I feel any kindness toward you, but because the second way leaves nothing for anyone, including me. After you're gone, I'll still have to remain in this city, and I don't want to remember what I did to you every time I walk through this grand hall." Voss studied him for a long time. Then he gave a short, dry laugh. "If your grandfather heard you say that, he would call you soft." "No, he wouldn't," Everett said. "He was once a doorman. He knew exactly what it felt like to stand at the bottom of a building while no one saw him. If he were sitting here, he would say exactly what I just said." Voss stood. He finished fastening his coat and looked around the grand hall at the people walking past, the people waiting in line at the desk, and the people pressing elevator buttons. "I waited 2 years for this company to collapse," he said. "In the end, everything was ruined because some woman pointed toward a door and threw a man who cleaned floors out of the room." "No," Everett replied. "Everything was ruined because another person who cleaned floors picked up the briefcase and locked it inside a locker." Voss didn't answer. He gave one brief nod, then walked through the revolving door, and Everett Donovan remained beside the window overlooking the river until Voss's figure had disappeared completely into the street. 1 year later, Meridian Sterling Tower still stood beside the river, but inside, it had changed. Eleanor Vance assumed the executive position after the board completed its selection through a process in which no one held an individual veto, and the first thing she did was remove the yellowed notice from the wall of the basement locker room. From that day forward, the building had only one elevator system, and the person pushing a cleaning cart at 7 o'clock in the evening rode beside the person who occupied the corner office on the 40th floor. Timesheets required 2 signatures, one from the manager and one from the employee who had worked the shift, and if anyone altered a single line, the name of the person making that change remained permanently in the record. In the courtyard behind the tower, where delivery vehicles had once parked, they cleared space for a small covered play area that opened in the afternoons for the children of night shift employees, with staff to supervise them and a corner with tables where they could sit and do their homework. The sun was bright that afternoon. The children's laughter carried all the way to the second-floor windows, and several mothers stood beside the fence watching their children play before beginning their shifts. The marble grand hall was once again crowded for the annual gathering. Everett Donovan entered through the front doors, still wearing a dark shirt and still carrying the worn leather briefcase with frayed corners that he had never replaced. The receptionist at the desk was new. She had never heard the story from the previous year, and she looked up at him with the smile of someone who had just begun her shift. "Good afternoon, sir. May I have your name?" "Everett Donovan." She checked the list, found his name, then handed him a visitor badge. "Please go up to the second floor. The elevators are on your right." Her voice didn't change at all after she read the title printed beside his name. It didn't need to change. Across the grand hall, 2 members of the board saw him and immediately rose from their chairs, but he merely nodded in greeting and continued walking. He stopped in the middle of the marble floor, in the exact place where a hand had pointed toward the door 1 year earlier. "Mr. Donovan." He turned. Tessa Marlowe stood several steps away in the light blue uniform of a nursing intern, her name badge fastened to her chest, because the tower's medical office now accepted final-year students for internships. She had completed the part of her education she had once left unfinished. Her grandmother was still at Hawthorne and still had lucid days, and on the cabinet beside her bed now stood a photograph of her granddaughter wearing this uniform. Tessa stepped toward him and extended her hand first. "This time, let me take you to a proper dinner," she said, "to make up for half a box of cold food last year." Everett looked at that hand, the hand that had once pushed half of her meal toward a stranger at 2 o'clock in the morning, that had once picked up a briefcase and locked it inside a locker, that had once held a pen beneath the rain and refused to sign. Then he took it. "I accept," he said. "This story leaves us with something very simple that people often forget. A person's worth isn't found in the uniform they wear, the floor where they work, or whether anyone else knows their name. It is found in how they behave when no one is watching, in the half portion of food they share with the person beside them, and in the page they refuse to sign even when they have almost nothing left. And the true measure of change in a person, an organization, or an entire society isn't how we welcome a powerful person walking through the door, but how we welcome the next person who cleans the floors when they walk through that same door." If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so we can continue listening to meaningful stories together every day. How did this story make you feel, and which detail remained with you most deeply? Please leave a comment below, because we would truly love to hear the feelings that come from the depths of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, happiness, and peace each day. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.